What happens when a stubborn sailor, a powerful empire, and a centuries-old dream all collide on the edge of the unknown? You get one of the most dramatic sea voyages in human history. Before GPS, before Google Maps, and way before airline tickets, one man sailed into the vast Indian Ocean with a mission so bold it would change the course of global trade forever. Meet Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese navigator who dared to reach India by sea, fighting storms, scurvy, and skepticism. But was he really the first European to reach India, and at what cost did his journey come? This isn't just a story of exploration, it's about ambition, empire, and a path paved in both spices and blood. Let's sail back to the late 1400s and trace the dangerous route that linked Lisbon to Calicut and reshaped the map of the world. The 15th century was a time of bold dreams and brutal competition. Europe was hungry for the East's riches, silk, porcelain, and most of all, spices. But here's the catch. Getting those treasures meant dealing with Arab middlemen and powerful Italian merchants who controlled the overland routes through the Middle East. Portugal, a relatively small kingdom at the time, had a big idea: bypass the overland routes and sail around Africa to reach India directly. This wasn't just a business plan, it was a national obsession. For decades, Portuguese sailors had been inching down Africa's coastline like careful chess players, mapping every bay and breeze. Then came Prince Henry the Navigator, who turned exploration into state policy. With his support, the Portuguese reached as far as the Cape of Good Hope by the 1480s. But getting around the Cape was one thing, crossing the Indian Ocean was another beast entirely. Enter Vasco da Gama. Born around 1460 in the seaside town of Sines, Vasco wasn't a royal or a scholar. He was a skilled navigator with a reputation for being tough, smart, and, let's be honest, a bit ruthless. In 1497, King Manuel I of Portugal gave him a mission: lead a fleet of 4 ships, sail around Africa, and find India. The stakes, monumental. If da Gama succeeded, Portugal would break the Arab-Venetian spice monopoly, become fabulously rich, and plant its flag across the Indian Ocean. If he failed, he'd be lost to the sea, like many before him. The race to India had begun. Vasco da Gama's fleet left Lisbon in July 1497 with about 170 men aboard 4 ships. The journey ahead was, well, treacherous. The sailors faced scurvy, storms, and long stretches without sight of land. But unlike earlier explorers, da Gama had one major advantage: maps and sailing knowledge passed down from previous Portuguese expeditions, especially those of Bartolomeu Dias, who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope a decade earlier. And round the Cape they did, after surviving massive storms and nearly losing ships. But even after crossing into the Indian Ocean, things didn't get easier. The crew was sick, supplies were low, and they had no idea how to navigate the complex world of East African and Indian Ocean trade. They reached the city of Malindi, in present-day Kenya, where they struck gold, not literally, but metaphorically. They met a Gujarati navigator, possibly an Arab or Indian, who knew the monsoon winds and agreed to guide them across the Indian Ocean. Using this crucial help, da Gama and his fleet crossed the Arabian Sea and finally reached Calicut, which is modern-day Kozhikode on India's southwestern coast, in May 1498. They had done it. For the first time in history, a European had reached India by sea. But Vasco's problems were far from over. The Indian Ocean trade network was already well established, dominated by Arab, Persian, Indian and East African merchants. The local Zamarin, or ruler of Calicut, didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. Vasco came offering some unimpressive gifts like cloth beads and hats. The Indian merchants were not amused. They were trading in gold, gems and spices, and these Europeans looked like desperate tourists. Tensions rose. Vasco barely escaped arrest, left Calicut with little to show for the effort, and sailed back to Portugal through hellish conditions, losing many men to scurvy. And yet, despite the hardships, Vasco da Gama was welcomed back a hero. Why? Because he had opened the door. Vasco da Gama's return to Portugal in 1499 changed everything. Though he brought back only a modest amount of spices, the symbolic victory was massive. He had found a direct sea route to India, bypassing the overland routes controlled by Muslim empires and Italian middlemen. For a Europe hungry for spices like pepper, cinnamon and cloves, this was revolutionary. King Manuel I was ecstatic. He awarded da Gama with titles, land and fame. But more importantly, he immediately sent out more fleets. The age of Portuguese imperialism in Asia had officially begun. In 1502, da Gama returned to India not as a humble explorer but as an armed admiral leading a heavily armed fleet. This time he wasn't interested in gifts or negotiations. He demanded trading rights and submission from local rulers. When they refused, Vasco used brutal force. He bombarded ports, captured ships, and even committed horrific acts like burning ships full of pilgrims and mutilating prisoners to send a message. He was no longer an explorer, he was an enforcer of empire. Da Gama's violent campaign established Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. Forts were built. Trade posts like Goa became key strongholds. Portugal had gone from a small European kingdom to a global naval empire in less than a decade, and Vasco da Gama was its sword. But history remembers both glory and blood. While da Gama's voyages paved the way for centuries of European colonialism, they also brought oppression, forced conversions, and exploitation. The Indian Ocean, once a thriving multicultural trade network, was now being reshaped by gunpowder and greed. And Vasco? After years away from the limelight, he was called back in 1524 as the Viceroy of Portuguese India to fix the corruption among Portuguese officials. Ironically, just months after arriving in Goa, he died of malaria. He had come full circle, dying in the very land he had once struggled to reach. Vasco da Gama's voyages opened the floodgates for European imperialism in Asia. Portugal soon dominated the spice trade, built a maritime empire stretching from Brazil to Japan, and introduced a new era of global colonization. Da Gama became a national hero in Portugal and a feared figure in the Indian Ocean. But his legacy is complicated. While he's celebrated in European history for his navigation and bravery, in India and parts of Africa, his name is often linked to violence, exploitation, and colonial dominance. He didn't just discover a route, he helped forge an empire. Today, statues of Vasco da Gama stand in both honor and controversy. His journeys reshaped world history, but the cost of that transformation, borne by countless colonized people, is still felt across continents. Vasco da Gama wasn't just a sailor, he was a symbol of a new world order. His voyage to India didn't just connect continents, it connected destinies, economies, and empires. While Europe cheered, much of Asia would later mourn the imperial shadow that followed. His story is a reminder, great discoveries often come with great consequences. As we remember the first European to reach India, we must also remember the ripples of power, pain, and transformation that voyage left behind. If you enjoyed unraveling the myths of history, hit that subscribe button. Infinitia Verity brings you the truth, one legendary tale at a time.